Tonight, tonight we're working on Christmas is a time for reconciliation. It's a hard subject, I think, for a lot of us. If you've ever been in a relationship that maybe went really well for you for a long, long time, and then all of a sudden, for whatever reason or a variety of reasons or whatever, that relationship that you kind of counted on and enjoyed in your life went to crap. I mean, you know how painful that is. Like, it only takes one. Doesn't take a lot, it just takes one. And it's like, once you get in there, it's kind of like, it feels like it's the never-ending vortex. And in most cases, the way out really is learning how to take Jesus by the hand, along with some help maybe from therapy and some other resources, this place, and start to be willing to take a walk, sometimes in a completely different direction than you ever expected. And we're going to talk about reconciliation tonight. And to kind of get started, Alex he had a story that he thought would fit, and I think it really does. This is what it says. This year, my dad, who was a pastor at the time, was caught in his addiction. The church leadership asked him and my mom not to attend the Christmas Eve service. The investigation was ongoing, and they wanted him to step back while the investigation happened. What they didn't count on, I don't think, was for me to show up at the service. I have a deep commitment to the tradition of Christmas Eve, and so when my parents said we weren't going to the service, I resolved that I would go by myself. Under the weight of uncertainty and the fear of what I suspected might just be a true accusation, I showed up to the candlelight service. Remember those, when those were like mid-11 o'clock jobs, and those were just challenging services, man. They just became more challenging along the way. But I mean, I remember those well. Families were there to celebrate. It was Christmas, after all. Well, I found my usual spot at the front, and as the first carols rang out, my tears began to fall. I felt like I was an imposter. I was a cloud of grief and darkness amidst a cheerful celebration. I felt guilty for dampening the time of rejoicing. As I sat, I found myself talking to Jesus. "I'm ruining your party," I told him. It was his response in that moment that changed Christmas for me forever. He told me, "Cassie, I came to that manger as a baby, not for those in celebration, but also for those in mourning. Cassie, I came for you, right in this moment, right here, right now. For the very first time in my relatively easy life, I was tasting heartache. And oh, if I only knew how much more would come." And it was there, in the middle of that heartache, that Jesus showed me what the heart of Christmas was all about. Jesus stepped down to pursue the broken and hurting and the lost. If this year broke you down, isolated you, left you grieving or fearful or hurt, I want you to know that you don't really have to come here and figure out how to muster up cheer. You don't have to feel like a downer in the midst of celebration. You can sit at the feet of a Savior who came for you where you're at right now tonight. That's how Emmanuel works. It's God with us, sometimes even in the dirt, giving us hope in the face of despair. Those who walk in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in spaces of deepest darkness, a light has dawned. So reconciliation is the third purpose of Christmas as we continue on with this story that we're calling Christmas with a Twist. My parents, I think I must have been 13 or 14 years old. And of all places, we're sitting at breakfast, and for some unknown reason, there was some kind of conflict going on. I can't imagine that would ever happen, but there was 6 of us, and for some reason, at breakfast, there was like a deal. So my dad kind of let it go. Well, my mother, of course, walked in. My dad was the breakfast guy, making breakfast on Saturday, and so it was a great breakfast. And I mean, he's making breakfast and all that, head down, and my mom kind of goes, enough. And she proceeds to tell us this story. She goes, when your father and I are in the middle of an argument or a disagreement, she goes, do you want to know what we do? And if I would have known what my mother was going to say, I would have said, please, God, no, I don't want to know what you do. My mother goes, well, what we do is, I can just imagine them doing this. She goes, what we do is, we take all of our clothes off and we stand there in front of each other completely naked until we get it worked out. I'm like, oh my God. I'm like, number one, I do not want to hear about my parents standing there in a room in broad daylight or any other freaking time, buck naked. I don't want to hear that. Number two, I don't want to hear my mother giving me advice about how to resolve a conflict when it involves nakedness. Number three, I definitely don't want to hear this at breakfast. So and all of us that heard that story, a couple hours later, were like, God, that story, why did she have to tell that? What? It's kind of wrecked us. It's like, if we would have known the word then, we would have used it, but it's like, that's kind of trauma right there, man. I mean, and then you get this thing that reconciliation is a very big piece of this Christmas story. If I'm at odds with somebody in my life tonight, and I feel an extreme separation from them, does it mean necessarily that I've got to be at odds with God? Because sometimes it can feel that way, right? That, you are at odds with somebody that you're in love with, or your friend or your family member. One of the first things that's going to happen is, it's kind of like one of the first touchstones, pastoral care-wise, is when you see somebody drifting away from worship and you can't put your finger on anything else, one of the first questions to ask is something going on with this person and some kind of relationship that they're having? But the thing about God is, he would never tell us not to come to church because of that. God actually expects stuff like that to happen, because the thing about God, if you think about it, God has been watching us be us our whole lives. And he's seen how many conflicts along the way. But see, God has this incredible solution that shows up in a couple of the 12 steps that Carol just read. In the 8th step, God says this. I think this stuff is absolutely inspired by God. I really do. And so in the 8th step, God, speaking through somebody else, says this. We made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. Notice we didn't make a list of people that had harmed us. Are you tracking with that? We start off, he says health is starting off with making a list of persons we had harmed and what was our level of willingness to make amends to them. The 9th step says, when we got to understanding what had happened to them, we got to kind of an understanding of how we had wronged them. We made direct amends to such people whenever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. Step 10 says, we continued to take personal inventory. What's happening in my life? What is my gut telling me? What am I feeling right now? How am I feeling wronged? How am I feeling like I'm being treated unfairly? What is healthy in my life? What is unhealthy in my life? What have I decided that I'm basically tonight and maybe for the whole week obsessing over? Like, what am I obsessing over? Who am I obsessing over? What is the content of what I'm obsessing over? And that probably will tell you a whole lot about what's going on with me. Took a personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. Step 11, thought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood God, praying only for the knowledge of God's will for us and the power to carry that out. What do you hear in this? You don't hear anything about anybody else except who? Me. Resolution and peace in our lives has got to kind of begin with us. You know, like, what's going on with me? What am I allowing this person to cause me to feel? Why do I feel this way? Is there a backstory to why I feel this way? Is there a disappointment that is like moving forward in my life now that I wasn't aware of? Has something taken me by surprise when Jack says to me this and this, a supposedly innocent comment? Why did I take that to the races and shoot it to the moon on a rocket ship and let it begin to completely dominate my life, wreck my day, wreck my week, wreck my month, maybe wreck my year, wreck my holiday, or whatever? Why is that happening? And like, God goes, well, do you want to get started with something that's healing? Let's you and I start together on us. Let's check out what about us is healthy. Let's check out what about us isn't working. Let's start with that, because God is brilliant enough to kind of know that whatever we feel with God, that we're at odds with God, you got to know it's going to show up somewhere else in your life. You got to know. And so God's bright enough to go, yeah, you know what? Before we get into who did this and who shot John and all this business, let's just start with you and me. Let's see why you have the feelings that you have right now. Let's see what's going on with you. Let's see why you're responding so intensely to what it is that's happening right now. Let's figure this out together. These steps of reconciliation, which is what they are, this reconciling process that we're going through right here, steps 8 through 11, these are really, I think, the precious gifts, one of the precious gifts that come from God. And so at the end of I'm a Lutheran guy and all that. So back in the day, I haven't done it in a long time, but back in the day, I don't even know right now if I could muster up a full-blown liturgical service and get through it. Carol, you remember me having I remember going down, I taught for a friend of mine at this church in Charleston in Goose Creek. I don't know if you know where that is, but taught there like 2 out of 3 Sundays. Last December, a couple Decembers ago, and maybe one time for him in the summer. Well, this service was a full-blown, no-holds-barred, Lutheran to the core service. And I'm like, communion, everything, all the pieces of that, and I'm like, and it involved like singing liturgy and all this business, and I'm like sitting up there wearing this robe and stuff going, God, I mean, you got me completely over my head, man. Like this, I just don't do this anymore. I'm like 20 years plus, for 25 years removed from that, because church I started in Hilton Head, I mean, like we were all contemporary all the time. Come here, all contemporary all the time. And to me, trying to figure that out at that point was like wild. And I'm kind of like just trying to like figure out how to get through. I had all kind of stuff going on in front of me. But I remember that one part, like, that one little statement that comes out of what you say right before you share the Lord's Supper with people, the gifts of God for the people of God. What do you think would happen to your life and mine if tonight we had this straight path to God? And what do you think would happen if God had a straight path to us? There's language in Scripture that talks about make straight the path to the heart. Make straight the path to the heart. Stop going down the crooked streets and stuff and kind of go, let's just forge a straight path. What if God had that straight path into your heart tonight? What do you think would happen? Do you think it's possible that God is challenging us to actual peace in relationships? Maybe think about the most difficult relationship you're in right now. Think about all the reasons you have why you feel the need, just like me, with something like that, to defend yourself, protect yourself, and make your valid points about what you're going to say and why you're going to say it. In most cases, one of the things I've figured out is kind of like, look, 10% of, and I mean, I'm not wired like this, but 10% of what goes on in a disagreement is logical and factual, right? 90% is what? Emotional, isn't it? 90% is emotional and or, I would go on to say, spiritual. 10% logical and rational, 90% emotional and spiritual. And yet, what do we spend a ridiculous amount of time on? Logical, rational, winning, defeating, getting the most points, all of that. What do we spend the most time on? Maybe, as silly as it sounds like, look straight ahead, Gabe. Just don't look, I swear to God, don't look the other way. It's bad over there. Look at me, man, here. I'll talk to you. Are you ready? Just look at me. Whew. He's suffering over there. I'm just telling you, man. Keep your eyes to yourself, young lady. It's just like we spend so much time trying to get to that point of logic and all that when, like, one of the things I'm still learning raising daughters, I wish I could say I learned it, I haven't, is my daughters just are not generally rational, logical human beings. I thought one of them was, but now even she's like flown the coop. Like there's that. But all the while, God's saying, you know what I'm challenging you to, don't you? I'm challenging you to peace. And for you to have the kind of peace that I want you to have, for you to be able to come your defense about logic and all of that, for you to try to get beyond that defensiveness, you're going to have peace that only I can really provide you with. That peace that I want to give to you is going to require gifts from me. You're going to need those gifts. The thing is, all that stuff really is it's the way that God planned it all along. He wanted us to need him. And we do. When we realize that we do, we're healthy. When we don't think we do, we're going to stay sick, sometimes for a good long while. If we would accept that challenge to kind of like have peace with God, and if we were to accept the challenge tonight of, in our relationships, maybe just pick the one that's the toughest for you. If you were to accept in a relationship, what would it be like if you valued peace with God over everything else? Over winning, over rightness, over righteous indignation, over whatever. And you decide that peace with God is the most important thing, principally because that peace comes from God. What do you think would change? If you applied that to one relationship, what do you think would change? Well, maybe it's entirely true that it's entirely possible that the answer to the question is, when it comes to you and Janie or whoever, the answer to the question is you at the least would get better. You at the least would find some healing coming from God. You would find some healing of the heart. You would find some freedom that's going to exist as a result of that healing. Now, there might not be a resolution available at that point in time between you and your sister, you and your brother, you and your friend, you and your mom, you and your dad. That might not be a resolvable situation, but the change that will occur is the one that's going to occur between you and God. There's a church in Noonan in Atlanta, south of Atlanta, and one of the things that really gets me about this guy that's the pastor is there is not a hint, there is not a whisper, there is not an anything in this guy. I listened to him now for several different weeks, and one of my kids goes there, and her fiance. So one of the things about this guy is the name is Foundations Church Noonan. There is not a mention at that church of, quote, be a good person. Not a peep, nothing. And like, I sit here and listen to that guy. That is so refreshing. I got to tell you, the fact that it's all Jesus all the time is so refreshing to hear and to hear somebody preach that. The be a good person thing, it just isn't there. I mean, it isn't there. And I love that. I mean, like, here's kind of an approach we might think about taking when it comes to Christmas being a time for reconciliation. What do we think would happen if we got in sync with God and then we hear what God is saying, but we don't particularly like it? Like, has that ever happened to you where you ask God point blank, what are you trying to show me, God? What are you trying to teach me, God? And God goes, let me be more direct, right? And he's like, this is what I'm trying to show you. And you go, you know what, God, I'm really not ready for that. I don't really want to hear that. And that God, I've never had God go, well, I mean, you don't like beets? I'll take them away. Like, I'll make it like we never had beets in the whole world. Here, have some corn. I've never had God do it. The beets stayed on my freaking plate. And God's like, yeah, we're going to keep having beets. Tuesday, what are you going to have? Beets. It's like being out in the desert. There's some reason somewhere, besides God getting a chuckle out of it, that when the people of God were out in the desert, every single day they woke up, what was their diet? You ready? Chicken and bread. Bread and chicken. Chicken and bread. Or the equivalent of chicken. Why so much chicken? Why can't we have hot dogs? Why can't we have steak? Whatever. Nope. Chicken and bread. Chicken and bread. There's a reason why God's doing that. When I'm not in sync with God and I don't hear God, what I'm really hearing is the enemy in my life disguised as God or disguised as me and my thoughts. Because there's then no challenge. There's no challenge to my thoughts. You don't have God going, Morgan, did you ever look at this? Did you ever see it that way? Because every time God starts to open stuff like that up in my life, honestly, the vast majority of what God's showing me, I've never thought of it. I've never envisioned it. I've never imagined it. It's a completely different viewpoint than what I have right then. Completely different. Because lots of times, if I'm honest, when something's happening that's tough for me, like I don't really, if I do my own personal inventory, I realize, yeah, I mean, like, I don't have the patience for this. I don't have the tools for this. I'm not the reconciling agent for this, but God. That's where, if I'm willing to be done, God's just getting started. But God, but God said, let's try it this way. As a matter of fact, if I'm even more honest, a lot of the time, I probably actually have the completely wrong set of tools. But God, that's the grace of God in Jesus Christ. He's like, you know what? We're not going to need your tools today. Just put them down, leave them in the truck, not necessary. We're not going to need your compass. We're not going to need your hammer. We're not going to need your tools of destruction. We're going to need something completely different set of tools. And then God says, let me ask you a question like, do you want to see? And even better, do you want to be in a miracle? Do you want to? It's kind of like going, for 23 years, my mother and I have not gotten along, or whatever it is you're going through now. For 27 years, I've had no decent relationship with my uncle, my dad, my stepdad, my whoever. And you got to take the distance part. If we're talking about sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, there's got to be that established distance. But outside of those kinds of instances, sometimes people end up estranged because they just kind of drift away. There's a pervasive thing going on, but they just kind of drift away. There hasn't been abuse. There hasn't been sexual abuse or anything traumatic like that. There's just been a drift. And God's like, do you want to see a miracle? Would you like to be in a miracle? Would you let me take this relationship between you and her? And would you be willing to trust me to see what I can do with that? Would you? You could almost see God like smiling so boldly, so excited for you to say yes, but willing for you to say no. I think that's just God's best day when you go, yeah, God, give it a shot. Like, I think we need to stop thinking of God the way we think of ourselves. Like, there's only so many miracles to go around. God's not going to love me the way that he loves her over there. God's probably not going to do a miracle for me because I haven't been that good of a person. God's probably not going to do that kind of work in me because, I don't deserve it. I don't deserve it. And God's going, hey, you see him over there? Do you see how far apart you all are? Would you like to be in a miracle? Would you like to actually see a miracle? What do you think it would be like if the two of you actually got to a place where you somehow, after 20 years, really understood each other, really could listen to each other, really could understand not listening to your heads or your thoughts or your words, but learning how to listen to your hearts? What do you think would happen? Is it possible that your heart this year or any other year can be reconciled, do you think, without the other person? God's doing that work all the time. The steps never say it's required of the other that they do this and this. If they do this, you can do this. The steps talk about you, what being reconciled inside of you and your heart is really all about. Can your heart be reconciled without the other being a part of the reconciliation? Actually, yes. It kind of takes me to this idea of there being a statute of limitations. Is there a statute of limitations on God loving us? No. Is there a statute of limitations where the miracle is not available to you? No. Is there a statute of limitations where God simply throws up his hands and gives up on you or your friend or your sister or your brother? No. No. There's not a statute of limitations. There may be a statute that says because of the kind of abuse you've suffered, you're going to experience that kind of reconciliation some other way, not in person. Maybe that's true. But what happens when God releases you from that kind of pain that they have caused? What happens then? What happens when God says, all this crap that's going on inside of you, where you keep hurting, you keep feeling victimized day after day, week after week, year after year, you know what? If you'll let me, I can go in there and I can clean that all out and I can give you that new heart that I've tried to talk about all along. I can do that. Tonight, God can do that. Tonight, that's why Jesus comes here to do exactly that. That's available in this place tonight. And man, if that's something you're getting to a place where you're willing to do, would love to talk to you about that anytime. And thanks so much for being here tonight. This is a hard topic. It's probably taken us in a million different directions. For me, it's taken me 10 different directions tonight already because I keep thinking about this person, these people, all the stuff that's happened so far in life. And it's plenty. And that's probably happened to a lot of us. And think of the last person that you've had that kind of a intense conflict with. Is it unimaginable right now that God can actually release you from that? Maybe it is. But maybe it won't be unimaginable tomorrow.